right, and at this point, I'm turning it over to the Scio Township Supervisor, Mr. Jack.
Yay, Jack!
Oh,
Yay!
Thanks, Bryce. Welcome, everyone. We're happy to have you here. I don't have a lot to say. We've got a lot of ground to cover. I don't want to waste anybody's time. I do want to point out that there's a lot of horsepower in the room this morning. We're lucky to have Debbie Dingell here, Michigan's 12th Congressional District. And Debbie Lasinski, our state rep for the 52nd District. We appreciate you being here. We have Scio Township trustees, Christine Green, Kathy Knowles, Evan Pratt from the Washington County Water Resource Office. And I think that's it, unless I missed somebody.
Amy Shaw from Senator Hughes' office.
Who is, I'm sorry?
Amy Shaw from Senator Hughes. We'll ask in a minute.
Thank you very much. Yeah, anyone else on the line? Any elected officials on the line?
Well, we want to know who's on
Michelle
the
D.
phone. Michelle Dietrich?
Yeah, Chip Smith.
Chip.
Thank you. I didn't mean to forget you.
So there's 3 people on the phone? Anybody else?
Cindy Mullenhour, Mediation Redevelopment Division.
4? Anybody else?
DEQ, sorry.
It's okay. Anybody else? Thank you.
Michelle Brunel.
Thank you for coming in.
DHHS, Michelle Bruno.
Yeah. Is that 6?
So we've got 6 people on the phone, I think. Probably at some point, Jack, should go around the room so everybody knows.
What's that?
We'll make sure we go around the room so those in the...
Yeah, so why don't we start from the far side and just go around the table and introduce yourself and your position. James, we'll start with you.
I'm James Moore, Vice Chair of the Sierra Club here in Valley Group.
Ellen Rabinowitz, Health Officer, Washtenaw County Public Health.
Vince Crusoe, board member of the Sierra Club, board member of CARD, and coordinating member for the Allen Creek Watershed Group.
Rita Love Caruso, I'm a member of CARD, and I'm also a professor of toxicology at the University of Michigan.
Kathy Knowles, Scio Township Trustee. I'm the Scio Township rep on CARD.
Chuck Warbahusky, Ann Arbor City Council.
Dan Hamill, I'm the DEQ project manager for the Gelman side. I'm in the Jackson District Office.
I'm Evan Pratt, Washtenaw County's Water Resource Commissioner.
Gerald Tiernan, I'm a District Supervisor for Michigan Department of Environmental Quality Remediation and Redevelopment Division in Jackson.
Debbie Dingell, your Congresswoman.
Michael Berkoff with EPA, Superfund Remedial Project Manager.
Donna Lasinski, 52nd House Representatives.
Roger Rail, citizen volunteer, co-founder, chair of Sci Residents for Safe Water, and I guess you could say co-founder and chair of CARD, Coalition for Action on the Remediation of Dioxin. I might be the only one on the tables here who isn't paid to be here.
Steve Kreider, MDHHS Drinking Water Unit.
Lisa Fisher, MDHHS Drinking Water Unit.
Dan Bicknell, Global Environmental Alliance.
Mike Moran, Ann Arbor Township Supervisor and Vice Chair of CARD.
Again, Jack Knowles, Scio Supervisor.
Howard Langer, City of Ann Arbor, City Administrator.
Christine Green, Scio Township Trustee.
Great.
And I've heard several beeps. Why don't we have everybody on the phone identify themselves again in the additional? So can those on the phone identify themselves, please? And even those that mentioned their names before, because I've heard 3 beeps.
Yeah, I'm Chip Smith, City of Ann Arbor, City Council.
Michelle Dietrich, Washtenaw County Commission and CARD member. Cindy Mullenhour, Remediation Redevelopment Division Case Coordinator.
Katie Lamar.
Washtenaw Commission, the chair of Washtenaw Commission. Keep going.
Amy Shaw from Senator Hughes' office. Jennifer Gresham, DHHS. And Michelle Brunel, DHHS.
Anyone else?
Sounds like you're good. Debbie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Oh, I'm going to be brief. I just I want to thank Mike and I talked some time ago about the importance of having these regular quarterly meetings, having I mean, we've made progress that the EPA has assigned somebody to this project, and he is trying to work with everybody here. And you can tell by the size of the crowd how much this matters, and we want to continue to keep this moving forward, trying to find resolution. We continue to have issues that some people are in court. We're also looking at moving it Superfund. How do we balance all of that to make sure we're communicating to all the stakeholders? We know what the issues are. We're working closely with DEQ. We're at a transition time. The career staff will stay the same, but there'll be a change. Whoever wins, there'll be a change in the governorship. We just want this to be a regular, orderly meeting that everybody comes together. We're communicating to everybody about what all the issues are, understanding the new issues, and keep working together to resolve this issue for the community and for the health of everybody. So having said that, I'm not going to talk a lot. We're here to listen. We've got a good agenda. Donna Lasinski's here, and I know that a couple of other state reps are trying to come. But and we really want to make sure we are coordinating at the federal, the state, and the local level.
Absolutely, and I agree with everything that Debbie said, and this is something we have conversations about quite often. One of the things that's so important is that as we come together and we're convening the federal, the state, and the local level, is that we are all making sure that we are rowing in the same direction, that these meetings are a good opportunity for us to say, you know, look, I thought we were heading in this direction. No, I thought we were heading in this direction. Here's where we need to go. And that is where I'm very appreciative of Michael's role in this, and having the EPA here to provide that kind of convening resource. We know at this table we're not always going to agree with each other around where it needs to go, but I think we all agree with the end point. And the end point is we want to know where the plume is, where it isn't, where it's heading, and what is our long-term plan to ensure the health and safety of all of our residents, recognizing the diversity of private wells and city water supplies. And where those two things happen, if we need to protect our private wells with expanded infrastructure, we need to be looking forward in the future. And it's only going to come if we make the efforts now to gather the data, to understand the problem, to take all the data sources that we have combined, and we have a convening resource that can pull all of that scientific information together. So I look forward to this meeting today. Again, I concurred. I do believe there will be changes afoot over the next 8 days, and that will present, hopefully, a few more challenges that we can overcome, and that with our consistent ability to work together, we'll handle it smoothly.
I agree with pretty much whatever that was said so far. One of the things that I've been harping on is the time scale. Back in 2000, the judge listened to the company, and when they said they could clean this up in 5 to 8 years, and established a 5-year plan. And of course, it wasn't cleaned up in 5 years. It wasn't cleaned up in 8 years. And according to some research that Dr. Lemke has done with his students, this could be many decades, if not centuries, to take. We have to address it for that long. So we have to look at a longer time scale than what we're used to. And like other compounds, like the PFAS family, we have to reset, we have to look way down the line, which means that we have to be very rigorous in our analysis and record keeping. In already 30 years, we've lost some data from the official database.
Roger, at this point in time, one of the things that was we wanted to modify from our last meeting was we didn't manage our time in our last meeting very well. So
right, I'm done.
Evan has some comments he'd like to make, and then right now, after that, Jerry and I would like to talk.
I would like to acknowledge that there are a lot of people in the audience too who have been major players in this for a long time. Laura and Kurt, I'm not going to get in trouble and start naming. And my legislative director, who is the constant with the EPA, is also here, Greg Sussman. Okay, Evan, you're on.
Sure. Well, I think Jack covered a lot of the introductions. Donna and Debbie covered pretty much all the bases I wanted to cover. But again, how is it going is the reason we're here. Is it growing? Where is it growing? What are the new issues that we need to be addressing? How are we doing on the known issues already? Those are kind of the three main things that we should be checking in on quarterly. And I think I want to also acknowledge that not everybody is in agreement on all facets of this. It's a pretty complicated spider web. So I do appreciate everyone who did come here that has been engaged in this issue a lot longer than I have myself. So I think with that, that's enough lead in. I'll also mention there is a sign-in sheet slowly going around. If that gets full, we've still got another sheet here so everybody who's here can be acknowledged as we wrap things up and so forth. But Michael, I think it's ready to just start doing what people came here to see.
Substance.
Thank you.
You want me to go first? You want to say something first, or?
Yeah, I think I'll do this very, very quickly because I don't want to spend too much time on this. I want to thank all of you for coming and participating in this and putting your time towards this. I really appreciate your involvement. It's not just today. It's for many of you, it's been a lengthy involvement spanning many years. I appreciate you bringing forward your concerns about the dioxin plume, and working with me to help track those concerns. I think it's an important step in the process here. I'm not going to speak any greater length right now, but hand over to Jerry.
Well, thanks again. My name's Gerald Tiernan. I go by Jerry. I want to thank everyone for coming. I appreciate you being here. I haven't been on the project for too long, but I think the perspective that me and Michael can bring from kind of coming into this more in a newer capacity has been helpful. So I was just going to go through the agenda. These are some of the topics that have come up. Pardon me?
John Hirsch has just been able to join in the call.
Well, thank you.
He's an EPA attorney.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. So the first topic that we have been talking about, or that has issues that we've been talking about in this group and in other groups, is the monitoring network itself. First I was just kind of going to show a generic slide, so to speak, that shows the area and some of the different things. The site itself is right in this area here.
The red.
Pardon me?
The red triangle.
Yeah, I apologize. This is smaller than I had expected it. But again, we are trying to get an overview, so it's not a horrible idea from the standpoint of an overview. This is the West Park area, what Liberty is right in here, right? So, yeah, a little bit south right in here. 103, which is a well that gets talked about quite a bit, is in this area here. And we're going to refer back to this quite a bit as we move to areas so that everyone understands what areas we're actually trying to talk about. So specifically, we've had a lot of questions about the monitoring program over the years. And I think as most everyone knows, but just to make sure it's clear, is we are currently, the current consent judgment is based off of a concentration of 8.5 parts per billion for dioxin. 85 ppb for dioxin, and it has been lowered to 7.2 ppb in state statute or in the cleanup criteria. That was one of the impetus for the renegotiating or the opening of negotiations to modify the current CJ to reflect the 7.2. Currently, we're in these negotiations. The negotiations are confidential, and I'm bound not to disclose some significant portions of the discussion. However, the current monitoring network itself is based on 85. As we move to the 7.2, part of the biggest parts of the negotiation is the negotiating of the monitoring network moving forward and what that would look like. So again, there's not a ton that I can talk about now. I know there's been a lot of issues with that CARD has brought up and others have brought up, like Dan Bricknell and them have brought up, and a lot of those are a part of the negotiation. The next,
Just want to
go ahead.
Just for a second. So,
yeah.
and I'm going to sound a bit repetitive of what Jared just said. I've heard the concern, EPA has heard the concern about the monitoring network not being adequate, and we've heard it voiced in many different ways. Our perspective is that the current network reflects an 85 parts per billion. They're trying to regulate to that level. As that number was shifting down to 7.2, that's what drove MDEQ into renegotiations to be able to change that monitoring network to be able to regulate to that level. So it is EPA's expectation that the network we have now will not be the network that will be there in the future once the renegotiations are complete, and that network can then regulate to the new cleanup number.
Do we have a time frame, generalized time frame on the period of negotiation?
There is no timeline set specifically. There's no deadline that are based on that. We've gone back and forth, exchanged multiple proposals, and continue to have meetings. But there's no defined timeline.
How long has it been since that started?
Dan, how long have we been renegotiating?
Well, we've been renegotiating with Gelman since 2015, and then we had some stakeholders requested the judge if they could be involved, and that started in December of 2016. So DEQ and Gelman have been negotiating in anticipation of a reduction. We didn't know it was 7.2 until 2016, but in anticipation of a reduction in that criteria. So then if you want to say the intervention in that negotiation has been since December and early 2017.
All right. The next topic, yes.
Just real quick, Kirk Profit, on that question from Representative Lasinski, is there a date when we should feel like the negotiations are delinquent?
I haven't gotten to that point yet because the negotiations have been fruitful. I mean, everyone's been at the table exchanging the ideas and stuff. So I don't know that I've had that thought because I haven't felt like we've had an impasse. I think that if we felt that we were at an impasse, we would move appropriately to document the impasse and discuss with the judge what the next steps.
Is there any tool in negotiations you don't have that you would ask perhaps for this team here to help you have?
I don't think so. I mean, the interveners group is providing, what I think would be a more, I don't want to say more of a voice, but is providing a voice for the stakeholders that they individually represent. So tool-wise, I think we're in pretty good shape as far as negotiating. And we haven't got to a final agreement yet.
How many times did you meet last year, 2018?
In the past, since it's been under confidential.
Oh man, as individual groups, as large groups, wow, I don't know. DEQ's met both with interveners, Gelman, other stakeholders throughout the year. I don't know that I know a specific number. It was 3 or 4 official.
Yeah.
Everyone.
Jerry, look at
yes.
all these questions are important. That kind of question has been enslaved to the Q&A. We still got to get to the meat of what. We got to get you a report. Okay.
Chris, you should come up to the table. Chris from Senator Peter's office.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to keep moving. I do believe that they were hoping to get some of the questions at the end, the Q&A. That way we can get through the presentations that we wanted to give, and then have open for question. And I think that's where Michael was indicating that there's the potential to go past noon. If there's more questions and then we're still here answering, we will stay and answer questions.
Sure.
So, the next topic of discussion has been the near surface water. And so this slide is kind of put up there to give you an idea. And I'll go back to the previous slide so we can kind of orient ourselves. We're talking about this area right in here, right? No. I get confused on it. Yeah, so right here where I have the actual arrow that says it there. It's right here. Apologize. So The question on the near surface water and the potential, risks associated with the potential shallow water has been something that we have looked at, DEQ and Gelman. In August of 2016, a shallow groundwater investigation in this area was performed. That investigation included the installation of temporary monitoring well network and a collection of shallow groundwater, which was then analyzed for the 1,4-dioxane. You have more?
No, it's under the next, where it's.
Oh, sorry, here we go.
Exactly where it was, yeah.
So, the 1,4-dioxane was only detected in 2 of the groundwater wells, RW12 and 13, which I've kind of highlighted right here. There's these 2 wells right here. And both of those detections are within what they call the prohibition zone. And the prohibition zone, I'm coming back to this map just to show it because it shows it as this red line. And based on the consent judgment, dioxane is allowed within this area, and it's prohibited from the installation of drinking water wells in this area. Let's see, so dioxane detected concentrations in both RL12 and 13 were significantly less than any existing and also the proposed state vapor intrusion screening levels. The concentration is also below the EPA regional screening value. So in conclusion, based on this investigation and other site information in the file, we've detected low concentrations of 1,4-dioxane in the shallow groundwater, but it does not pose an unacceptable vapor intrusion risk, and that further investigations do not appear to be warranted in this area at this time. But evaluation of data as we move forward, every time we get new data, we come back to this list of issues and see if there's an effect on either previous decisions that have been made in the past or provide more insight on the discussions that we're currently having. So again, any new information that comes up in this area or anywhere on the site that would affect our interpretation of the risk associated with the shallow groundwater, we would revisit that issue.
Where's the nearest well that would be feeding those locations? And what is the concentration at that well?
Are you talking about near shallow groundwater well or a?
Where is that dioxin coming from?
Back to it's coming from the plume.
Where's
right,
the closest? Where's the closest monitoring point that would show where that's coming from?
MW82 is at this one. I can't read it because of the.
Yeah, right there.
Yeah.
And
okay, so I guess it would be this one right here.
Yeah.
Plus all the information that we have from the investigation itself. Because we typically are going to be looking at the risk associated with it being there. So the risk with the shallow groundwater has been evaluated because we took samples of the shallow groundwater and looked at it and compared it to the various criteria and then other information that we have.
That's what's there now, but what's going to happen? How long is it going to take the dioxin that's at MW82S to get to West Park as the land surface falls away and exposes that aquifer?
Roger, that speaks to a slightly different topic. I appreciate how you're.
Not really. That's shallow.
Roger,
shallow.
If you give me a chance to speak a second, I'd like to try and. When I say it speaks to a slightly different topic, it's something I'd like to discuss as a part of today's conversation, and that's about the plume analysis. That's another. It's something we're covering today. Everything is integrated. I get that. And so if we talk about the plume analysis, it's to help us understand, I believe, all these different questions. And I appreciate where you're getting at here. But what we're talking about right now is are the current conditions. And so we're trying to take a look at what is the snapshot now of the current conditions. We are mindful that we also have to look at future conditions. And I remember very distinctly one of the two of the figures that I've seen on this entire site that stand out the most is the two that you've shown me. What did the plume look like at the very beginning in about 1990, and how did it look in, I think it was the 2015 map you showed me.
And so that's something I keep in mind as I work on this site. So, but I'd like to try and, the way we're trying to approach this is, and part of the way I've been tasked, is looking at what is the current snapshot, are there exposures going on right now that pose an unacceptable risk? And then the question is, are there future exposures that we need to be mindful of? And so that's going to kind of get to when we start talking about our tools that we're going to have to take a look at those future exposures. I see where you're going, but I don't want to have this be a lengthy conversation of...
I just want to point out that the timescale on this might be a lot shorter than 5 years.
Well, let's put a marker on that concern, and I think I'm going to be able to pick that back up when we talk about the plume analysis.
Dan Hamill indicated there's a new data point. I was wondering if you would give that to us from the Allens Creek analysis that they did a couple weeks ago.
The surface water stuff? We'll get to that. It's a topic on the agenda.
Independent? Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yep, we talked about it when we get to, I believe it's within the GSI discussion. So
I guess this might be an opportunity too for, when we look at the current snapshot, looking at the concentrations that we have seen in the near shallow groundwater and what the screening levels are, the appropriate screening levels for like vapor intrusion, and also looking at some of the more qualitative concerns like the infiltration into basements. EPA has looked at that question at other sites and what I'm talking about here is people have raised the concern of as maybe in a storm event, when water comes into basements, especially when you have a contaminated groundwater plume in that area or in the near shallow, what kinds of concentrations are coming into the basement? And is there a residual risk afterwards when the water recedes? Does it leave some kind of precipitate there that would then pose a risk? Having looked at it at other sites, we see that that's just not a significant risk, especially relative to any kind of vapor intrusion risk there might be there. And already we're well below the screening level of 1,900 parts per billion for the vapor intrusion risk. People have also asked the question, well, what about when that water is in direct contact with the basement? And we've discussed that with the risk assessors for DEQ. And their feeling is that actually when the water is in direct contact with the basement itself, it has no room to volatilize. And so that basement can actually form a bit of a barrier to the groundwater, and there's not the volatilization that occurs there. So kind of conceptually, we feel comfortable with that number staying the same as it comes in both the situation where the groundwater is below the basement and when it's in contact with the basement as a vapor intrusion number. And then given also as that vapor intrusion number of 1,900 parts per billion is so far above the detected concentrations in the area, we think this is an issue which has been well researched, and we think this is one of the stakeholder issues that at this point in time we feel is been addressed.
Have you looked at the economic effects of having contamination in people's basements? The west side of Ann Arbor's got a lot of wet basements.
I appreciate where you're coming from on that one. Superfund regulations, actually, in the preamble for CERCLA, it specifically talks about the cost. When we look at cost within Superfund, you're specifically not allowed to look at the economic benefits or economic loss or anything like that. It's just something that's not quantifiable. I appreciate where you're coming from, and I've heard different people at this site and at other sites talk about just simply the economics and the impact of property values in contaminated areas, whether it be Superfund sites or not Superfund sites. And I think depending upon the individual, whether or not they'd rather be a Superfund site or not, we're kind of going down a rabbit hole. And but I recognize that discussions of contamination at properties has an impact. And that's one of the reasons why also I think that as we're in this venue, for all of us to be very careful and very deliberate with what we say so none of us have unintended consequences to our words.
Can we get a write-up of that EPA analysis of the risk for basements? I caught some of what you're saying, but I'd like to be able to make sure, back to being careful about what we say, I'd like to make sure I can properly.
Sure. Let me, let's be in touch about that after the meeting and see what I can provide for you. Absolutely.
And Michael, if I understand you correctly, though, I mean, there's two different things we're talking about. One is there is an aquifer with dioxane in it that is in the groundwater, and if it's not raining outside and someone's getting water into their basements, I think that's what Vince is talking about. Whereas if it rains and someone's basement gets wet, it seems logical to think that's not coming from groundwater. That's if your basement's only getting wet in relationship to rain, that's maybe a different issue than a contaminated groundwater issue. I mean, we can't say for sure, I suppose, but it would seem like if your basement's only wet when it rains, you're talking about rainwater that's kind of getting in your basement.
Yeah.
Then that doesn't mean that there isn't a groundwater plume with dioxane that could be getting there, though. But you're saying we haven't seen that as yet with the data.
Yeah, as again, and also the things to the vapor intrusion exposure route, because you're talking about inhalation exposure when it's vapor. We think actually presents a greater risk than sometimes that if it's the water coming, because if there's just direct contact, it's less of a risk than when you actually have inhalation exposure.
Okay, I missed your point. Thank you.
Want to take the question here?
Was there? Oh, yes. Sorry. Yes, please.
Is there any funding available for monitoring people's basements?
As far as EPA, I think it's not a question that EPA doesn't have available funding for that. Right now, this is not a Superfund site. This is not. We haven't had that discussion about funding funding the monitoring of people's basements.
And you're talking about vapor in people's basements. I have two grandsons who play in the basement a lot, so I'm concerned about that. And they are within the...
I understand, and that's why we developed these screening levels. So the screening level in terms of, that the screening level functions as a trigger for when we believe we need to then do some additional monitoring, do some additional studies. So right now, if we're at the concentrations in many of these locations are non-detect. We're seeing as high as 2 or 3 parts per billion, and what the screening level is 1,900 parts per billion. So right now we believe, based upon what the available data demonstrate, that we're well below that screening level. So we're well below the area where we think we might have some kind of exposure that poses a risk.
I wonder if it would be helpful for some people if you would explain exactly what the term screening level means in this context.
Sure.
And what going over that screening level triggers.
Sure. So a screening level is a number that's calculated based upon a risk analysis. I'm not going to try and get into the detail of the risk analysis, trying to look at too many details, but I'll give a few. So trying to look at different receptors, looking at, so if it's a residential analysis, it's trying to look at very likely the most sensitive inhabitants are children. So trying to look at a chronic exposure to a contaminant by a receptor. So it would be a child or maybe a person, you would do a 30-year time span. And you would possibly concentrate the risk, or you have an elevated risk in the first 5-6 years of your life. I'm getting a little bit too much in the weeds here, and I apologize for that. Basically, you try to look at a chronic exposure to a contaminant, and what are the likelihood for, so if you're analyzing for cancer risk, what's the likelihood they develop cancer in their lifetime based upon a chronic exposure to this contaminant. And then you look at the number of the factors into that number is different ways it's uptaken by a person. So you get into the characteristics of the toxic or the contaminant, or the chemical itself.
and how those interplay with environmental, how to volatilize the environment if you're looking at vapor intrusion, how it would be the uptake within a person, and then if you set that range of the 1 times 10 to the minus 6 times 1, ranging from 1 times 10 to the minus 4, risk of cancer for 1 in a million versus 1 in 10,000. I was a bit turned around on this one. We look at a risk, a range, and like what's the likelihood of them developing cancer within their lifetime based upon just a chronic exposure to this contaminant. So in Michigan, looking at drinking water, they set it at 7.2 parts per billion. That reflects a 1 times 10 to the minus 5 risk of a person developing cancer in their lifetime based upon chronic exposure to drinking water from the groundwater.
But it's 32-year lifetime.
Well, yeah, it does set a 32-year lifetime for the chronic exposure. And that makes assumptions as to how many days per week, what's the volume of water you're drinking each day, or days per year. And then you see these numbers, so 7.2. So 7.2 becomes that's more of a screening level for, which is enforced, but for, like, say, a screening level at 1900 parts per billion for vapor intrusion, once you get to 1900 parts per billion, or once you're above that, then that would trigger further investigation of the property to see possibly doing indoor air sampling to see what the actual concentrations are in the air. Sorry, we have a long-winded conversation, but basically you develop these screening levels, and then once those are exceeded, you would come in and do additional studies to find out what the actual levels are in that individual property, because each property has different characteristics. And so what actually would make it in would depend upon a lot of site-specific issues. The characteristics of the property, the characteristics of the geology underneath the earth underneath the property in terms of how readily can the vapors make its way into that property. So that you would then do additional more sites, location-specific studies.
But if I was to summarize where we are right now,
Yeah.
if I understand what's been presented, is that we have a monitoring network that's being negotiated moving forward to get us to an understanding of 7.2, and with the surface water, where we had concerns, where there was visible surface water present and there was water present in basement. Of all of those purple triangles up there, there were only 2 that showed detectable dioxane, and they were at levels that were, compared to the 1900, they were at 2 and 3 parts, so per billion, versus the 1900 vapor intrusion limit. So they were many times below. So at this point, there is no immediate concern that we have vapor intrusion from the surface groundwater impacting our residents in that area.
Yes, and I would go further and say that some of the other exposure concerns in terms of the seeps in the area, we think this what we've seen from the concentrations, that they're low enough that we don't believe those pose an immediate present risk in that area.
But we will be continuing on a go-forward basis through these negotiations to ensure that there's a monitoring network that keeps us apprised of the concentrations around there and would result in an immediate investigation if there was anything that triggered that made us think that this was changing in any material way.
Yes, but I would say we, in terms of DEQs working with Gelman, EPA is not a part of those negotiations, but EPA,
But I'm going to assume that that is a part of the negotiation, of which there is a wall between me and those negotiations.
EPA is operating under the same assumption.
Thank you.
But EPA is also monitoring that. In this, so that you are making sure, because obviously any resident is concerned if there might be the possibility, and as you said, it's not immediately, but you are in your work ensuring that that is being monitored at DEQ.
Yes.
Is there anything different about how dioxane volatilizes for vapor intrusion issues than other compounds that we need to worry about?
Speaking with other project managers, we have dioxane sites where they've looked at vapor intrusion. They're just not seeing it. They're not seeing it being a compound that readily volatilizes
Right.
for vapor intrusion.
It tends to stay in water, so if the water vapor evaporates and it has dioxin in it, is that a different exposure concern?
I don't think so. I think that it's...
Is that more like drinking the water or breathing?
No, I think based upon what I've talked about with other project managers who work on these kinds of sites, they're just not seeing the dioxin posing a vapor intrusion threat.
Well, if you have a wet basement and the water's contaminated and it starts to evaporate in your basement, that's what Roger's alluding to, that you're going to get exposure based on the fact that the dioxin will evaporate with the water.
I understand what you're saying, but the what we're still talking about is a screening level of 1,900 parts per billion as far as the concentration.
And it's really 280, because if you have over 280 in your basement and you're pumping that into the Yallens Creek, you're in violation of the groundwater surface water interface, which is 280 now. Used to be 2,800.
What we're detecting in the shallow groundwater, it's either not in a lot of the wells we have there, it's not detected. So I appreciate the exposure pathway we're talking about, but as far as what we're seeing in terms of concentrations, it's just not at these levels that
Well,
you're...
They're finding at West Park, 11 blocks up from West Park, it was over 1,000 part per billion. And it's flowing towards West Park.
I understand what you're saying, and this is actually something that we're going to, again, pick this up, I think, when we talk about the necessity and of the screening tool. Or plume analysis tool, not screening tool.
Okay, let's continue.
All right. So the next topic is kind of a combined topic. It's this groundwater migration pathways and the trend analysis. So, quickly with the trend analysis, it's been requested, both DEQ and EPA are currently working together to complete a more comprehensive plume analysis. We've had one in a quarterly report. There was lots of comments on it, and DEQ recognizes the comments, and we're going to work with EPA to come up with a better trend analysis that's going to be provided in a future or the future quarterly report. And as we start talking about this groundwater migration pathway, we lead back to we're always collecting and reviewing the site data that's being collected in the context of its potential effect on our current understanding of the site conditions. As part of this review, we verify that the data collected with respect to potential migration of the groundwater plume continues to meet the conditions in which the plume is allowed to remain in the area based on the consent judgment. The current data and our analysis indicates that the drinking water pathway from this site is currently mitigated throughout the area. There is no one drinking this water. There's been some specific questions on, I'm going to go to the next, with an area that's considered to be 465 DuPont Circle, which is on this figure is right in this area here. And let me see, I probably should go back to get us oriented with where this figure is. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, is this M14 right here?
M14.
And then this is 94.
Yes.
So you're just north of 94, you're just kind of southeast of M14 in this area here. Specific. So, data from our monitoring well network continues to demonstrate that the plume itself is within the established prohibition zone, and that it does not appear that the plume is migrated outside of the prohibition zone greater than the 85 ppb, understanding that that's the current CJ 85 and that number is going to be is negotiatingly being changed. As such, the monitoring network itself will have to adjust that to that new number. Some low levels of dioxin have been found in some of the monitoring wells that are north of this area, north of Dexter Ann Arbor Road. These, they're kind of, we believe they're the result of the dispersion and diffusion of the plume as it heads east towards the Evergreen extraction well. which is, as you start to turn like this, it's just diffusion through that area. These interpretations are also, well collaborated with the residential well sampling that's being done. We do extensive, both the state does well water sampling through the county, and also Gelman does some selected drinking water well sampling as well. We've done some extensive sampling by Washtenaw County in this area. 1,4-dioxane has not been detected in any of the residential wells that are north or northwest of this DuPont area.
Jerry, can I interrupt just for a second? I want people to understand that it's really fortunate that DuPont Circle was sampled. It was a homeowner well. Up until that time, there were no samples at that elevation. Those sample wells that were put around it were put there because the homeowner well had high concentrations, not as high as it is now. But we're really fortunate that homeowner well happened to be there to catch that branch of the plume. Now, I will also point out that the wells around it, as I pointed out to the DEQ a couple times, is at a different elevation than the screened area of 465 DuPont. They're like maybe up to 15 feet shallower than 465 DuPont. So we really don't know where the dioxane of 465 DuPont is going. And I'll end at that, just so people know that there's some unknowns there that haven't been addressed.
Did you want to?
Well, we've talked about, I was going to ask you, we've talked about the big picture here with this question. We appreciate the fact that there's some questions about the screening level at 465 DuPont. It's within the prohibition zone, so at that particular location, as far as does that impact current exposure? I think the answer is no. We know that the current exposure within the area, it's not happening. As far as downgrading of that, where we're looking more towards the edges, I believe we have wells there to be able to pick up the concentrations between higher concentrations, further south to the edge of the prohibition zone. So I'm not saying we have a perfect understanding at 465, but at these areas where we're trying to discern, is stuff leaving the prohibition zone. I think we have currently we have a network in place to be able to monitor for 85, and then in the future, I expect us to have a network in place that would be able to monitor for 7.2. I will also take this time for a second, having just asked Roger and Vince to table 2 points they made. I do want to bring up those points as being important. Vince talked about there's upgrading of this West Park area. There's detections up as high as 1,000. That speaks to, and Roger made his point earlier about another monitoring well in terms of what's upgrading of that area. What do you see at 82? That speaks to the necessity of a plume analysis that's going to have predictive value. EPA takes responsibility for the fact that the first analysis we think could be improved, and we're going to work with the DEQ on making sure that the plume analysis has a more robust statistical analysis of what we're actually seeing in terms of trends, and also see if we can look at it in such a way that's going to be have more predictive value in terms of what we should be expecting of this plume in the near and distant future. Also trying to make sure
that surface. Are you talking about near surface and deep, or just the deep well?
I think we've been looking at the whole plume, and so we're going to be working with DEQ. So the next plume analysis is going to be more comprehensive and also readily understandable. We understand that the audience is not just the not just regulators like EPA and DEQ, but it's going to be for something to be understandable by the general public and a bit of a resource. So that's something that we're going to be making sure that's being improved. We're going to be working with DEQ to come up with an analysis
that's going to help address some of these concerns that Vince has brought up.
Jerry, at the last quarterly meeting, you indicated, or DEQ indicated, that in the DuPont Circle area, there is a northwest, if you will, dispersion migration. Do you all still see that in DuPont Circle, it is moving to the northwest towards Rose Drive, Elizabeth Road, and towards M14? I believe you all indicated that that was the case at the last quarterly meeting.
Right, we have positive detections in the 129, that area, so there was 1 ppb, 2 ppb detections that started several years ago. I don't have the right in front of me, but we have instituted, seeing that there, we've instituted sampling of the Rose Drive residential wells with the county on a 2-year rotating basis. So we've collected 2 samples up in Rose Drive, so 2 sets of samples. We did it this last year, and there was non-detect in the Rose Drive area. So that we will continue to sample the wells, residential wells outside the plume area, based upon requests from stakeholders and an evaluation of DEQ and Washtenaw County, who has much more knowledgeable of the residential wells in the area. So we evaluate that every year. We've implemented residential well sampling at that location and other locations at the request of stakeholders in this room. So we will continue to do that. And then again, the monitoring, as Jerry has said, the monitoring plan that with the monitoring wells you have there are sampled on a agreed to time frame, quarterly, twice a year, once a year. We evaluate that, and as mentioned several times, that was for 85, and we are currently talking about that, the new criteria, what we would need to monitor for 7.2, and which is quite a bit less than 85, and that will be implemented at some time in the future.
Thank you.
Dan, do you think that that dioxane at 121 and 129 is coming from DuPont Circle, or could it be coming from a source farther west?
I think, in my opinion, it's coming from dispersion of the high concentration around the 465, around that the DuPont Circle Evergreen. I think it's dispersing a little bit to the north. We have monitoring well detections along Elizabeth Road, and was just out of the photo there, out of the picture. But we've had those for many, many years, and that has stayed the same. So if something was, I think, coming from the west, we would get an indication more at Elizabeth. So we haven't seen that. So my opinion is that it's just a little dispersion of the plume. It's with the majority of the plume in that area going to the east. Realize that on the photo we have LB2, LB4. Those are pumping wells, so it's drawing water. It's part of the what's in the consent judgment. It's drawing water. So my opinion is the majority of the contamination in that area is going toward that to the east, within the prohibition zone where it's allowed to move around. And that little residual we started picking up some years ago, 121, 129, is just a little dispersion. We will keep our eyes on that. If it suddenly starts increasing, then we will definitely take a look at that.
Well, Dan, I'm thinking of 133 west of that, outside the prohibition zone, that's still increasing. And so I think you should take a look at the possibility that those readings at 121 and 129 are actually coming more from the area of 133, which is outside the prohibition zone.
Yes, it is, and I think those are 133. We're getting into the weeds here, but I think that reflects.
Well, that's where the dioxane is in the weeds. That's the problem.
I understand that, but what we're trying to do, I think we keep our eye on 133. It is a compliance. It's a compliance monitoring well. That nest is a compliance monitoring well for the western area, which we're talking about the eastern area. You know, when we get to the west, that is a compliance monitoring well, so we observe that, they have to, it's on the monitoring plan, and we can take a look.
I'd like to stop this conversation for just a second.
Yeah.
This is a valuable demonstration of how challenging it is to be able to talk about a very complex site and multifaceted site in a limited time period. The take-home message that I have on this in this area is that currently we don't have exposure at levels that pose a risk. Is there some uncertainties? Are there some uncertainties that need to be further worked out? Absolutely. I think that some of what we're working on together in terms of a plume analysis should be able to show some of the trends in this area, and that might be then more informative for future discussions. By asking us all to move on from this topic, I'm not trying to diminish the concern here, but simply say that I think that we have other issues, other topics we need to tackle in a limited time period. Certainly there's things that we need to figure out more in this area, but at where we are now, there isn't the exposure to unacceptable levels currently.
I just want to point out quickly, and you're all adults and can manage your time. And it's a good conversation, but we now at the point, we do need to wrap up so we can get to the stakeholder reports. Right now we have 30 minutes for stakeholders and we have 30 minutes for Q&A. So do it any way you want, but I'm just reminding you that I don't want anybody to be missed, because the intent of this agenda was to make sure everybody had a chance.
Go ahead.
No, we're probably going to express the same
I
concern.
mean, what I want to say is that we're trying, this is very complicated. And EPA, DEQ need to understand the people who are living near this plume, and I know you do, are scared that they're, and by the way, just for the record, there's no credibility with any environmental agency after some of the things that have happened. Having said that, there are a lot of people committed, and that's what we're trying to do, is to bring all the stakeholders in to ask the questions, get the answers, do the analysis, and protect people. And I do think that there are enough stakeholders here that everybody, it's transparent, we're being held accountable, they're going to do the analysis of the plume to figure out what's there. But the agencies, and we're going to have a change in leadership at the top of DEQ, you guys will keep doing, needs to understand what it's like to live in a community that has a plume. And that emotion is just always there. That fear is just always there. And we got to try to bring objectivity and analysis and facts and technology to get the damn thing cleaned up ultimately. And that's what we're doing here.
Right.
And I appreciate that, and I'm going to make my apologies for asking the first question while you were moving through your reports, but I think that on this idea that we're separating the stakeholders from the presentation today is a little bit of a difficult dichotomy, and I am looking forward to to us making it through these. I don't know that if there's a stakeholder report that is kind of being handled as we're moving through these questions.
I've been throwing in some part of what I would be talking about.
So what I would hope is that as we have folks who have asked questions, if you see that really as kind of what you were planning on doing during your stakeholders reports, that maybe we can dive into these very specific evidence and progress that's been made in the last 3 months, and maybe we have a little seed time from the stakeholders reports as we're answering those questions, if what you're doing right now is kind of inserting into this conversation what you were planning on presenting during a stakeholder report.
I guess the gist of what I'm saying is that the regulation and oversight of this does not match the scale of the problem. This is probably the largest dioxin contamination of its site in the country, if not the world. And we should have the due diligence increased to handle it to that extent. We can be the model of how to clean up sites like this, and especially other very persistent, hard to clean up compounds like PFAS. We have 30-plus years of pretty good data on this. We should be learning from that. We should be tackling this with all the resources, and we are doing that in CARD. But we're not getting much buy-in from the regulatory agencies of how urgent this is to eliminate some of these unknowns so that people don't have fear. They might still have some uncertainty, but the uncertainty is reduced because we're doing more due diligence to the scale to match the problem.
So I think that's where if we can continue through this agenda and get a real sense of where you're heading and where the evidence is showing us and what's needed, that will help us if we can get through these agenda items.
I think we need to summarize these other points. And I think, Roger, I do think that we got two problems. Like, I have no idea what is being discussed in the consent agreement, but my sense is that some of the things that you were talking about is being addressed. And at the same time, the potential for a Superfund site, which will also is sitting there. So I do think, I don't know, but I think all of us have a sense of urgency that that you share, and we're going to make sure that they are held accountable. Is that a fair thing to say?
I think so. You know, and then EPA definitely appreciates the concerns of the community. It's one of the reasons why the approach that we want to take as far as how to track this site, as it's in the other, we call it the other cleanup authority, when we go through a preliminary assessment, which we did for this site, and then we, when the state asks us and says they'd like to keep the site, and we refer it back to them, we do it under what's called the other cleanup authority. As a part of that process, it's normally an annual reporting on what is the what's the status of the site. We felt that given some of the particulars of this site, including the level of concern by the stakeholders, that a more frequent reporting was necessary. And then given especially listening to stakeholders and their specific concerns at the site, which have been well articulated over the years, that it wouldn't be, the right approach would not be for EPA to take all the information, sit back, have a, kind of a only internal evaluation and then come up with some answer, but rather to go through the process of listening to every stakeholder concern, looking at the available data, and then trying to work through each of those concerns until we can get to some kind of answer. And so that's why we've taken the approach we have, because of the level of concern by the stakeholders and our feeling that those concerns need to be worked through.
Yeah, so if we could get back to Jerry's bit, I don't think we're going to answer all the questions that come up today, but we do want to be mindful that there are a lot of stakeholders here today, and I think I know Bryce budgeted a little extra time knowing that it would take a little longer. We still would like to get to a point by noon, at least, that all the stakeholders have had a chance to put their marker in the stand, so we'll probably go around the table after Jerry wraps up. Maybe that's the easiest way to get that kind of stakeholder feedback. But with that, I'd like to let Jerry maybe finish as best he can uninterrupted. If you've got a thought or a question, it'd be great to write it down when it pops in your head. And we've got a Q&A period right here at the end.
All right.
You got minus 30 minutes to do this.
Okay, so.
You ready? All right. All right, the next topic that we wanted to have a discussion on or provide some information, additional information on, was the GSI pathway, which is the groundwater surface water interface pathway. And that is, in layman's terms, it's when the groundwater actually vents and leaves the ground and enters a surface water. So we have done quite a bit of surface water sampling. We did a second round just about a month ago, 6 weeks ago. Dan and staff and even our attorney took some samples of the surface water within this area. This map reflects every one of those dots as a location in which surface water was collected. This most recent round found concentrations ranging from a non-detect, which is 1 part per billion, and the highest sample we found was 19 parts per billion. The current GSI criteria, the groundwater surface water criteria, is 280 ppb for surface water not protected for drinking water, and 3.5 for surface water protected for drinking water. This groundwater surface water interface is a big topic of confidential negotiations. So there is some pretty limited information that I can provide on this. DEQ, typically when we're negotiating any type of an agreement, but specifically GSI compliance in any agreement, we are trying to get it as close to, if not exactly, what is required under Part 201. As far as I can say about that, we're always looking to move into more compliance with 201 than less compliance with 201. So, as such, there's limited information I can talk about. We really wanted to have this as a presentation of just, that we are still doing the surface water sampling. We did it this time. We did find a little bit of a higher concentration at 19. The previous highest we had found, Dan, was 5.
Where's 19?
5. 19 is your Allen Creek.
Our backyard?
No, we didn't find it. Your swirl chamber.
West Park.
Right at 7th there, yeah. Which would be one of these ones, right?
Yes.
Yeah, one of these ones right here.
From 5 to 19.
Yours is non-detected again.
Theirs was non-detected.
Yes, Glendale, Allen Creek, Glendale was on detected.
Yeah, and that data hasn't been in-house all that long, so I think it just got released Friday, right? I think we sent it out to...
We sent it out to the local units of government first, and then I told you this afternoon if I get back in time, it'll go out to the core group like I normally send out, and it'll be sent to be posted on the webpage.
Does any of this apply to the 3.5 drinking water standard? Is this all at 280?
There is still discussions overall about what number should be the compliance number.
Okay.
Because we do understand that the Ann Arbor drinking water supply wells in Barton Pond, that answer, to be honest, that answer has not provided itself yet, clearly. To be honest, I have heard everything from no way to yes. So, and so we're still evaluating that, to be honest.
Keep going?
Yep. All right. The next topic we wanted to talk about, I want to make sure, is the consent judgment violations. There's been several questions brought up about the existence of a violation already that has already occurred, specifically with NW 103. And if I go back to where we say 103 was right in this area here, right?
Just go right, the one right, no, go up, that one right there.
Right there, 103. So this well right here,
Yes.
that it was out of compliance.
Meaning?
Out of compliance would mean that they've exceeded 85 ppb on 2 consecutive sampling events, Cam?
Right, that's basically, that well is 500 or 600 feet inside the prohibition zone. We DQ voiced concern years ago to Gelman, and what we came up with, we asked them to change their sampling to more often, and what we came up with was some compliance letters sent to them that basically identified that we would consider them out of compliance if they had 2 consecutive months of any lab above 85 ppb. When I mean any lab, Gelman samples it, DQ samples it, Gelman sends it out to outside labs. So with that compliance interpretation that we gave them in our discussions, they have not been above 85 in 2 consecutive months. As you can see, you can see where the 2 compliance letters are listed, and then after that, there's a 99, there's an 85, and there's an 87. But that none of them occurred in 2 consecutive months. The 85 was not above 85. And in discussions in-house with DEQ and the AG, I mean, they were not out of compliance. Realize out of compliance in the CJ is above 85 going outside the prohibition zone. We narrowed that down at 103 with our compliance letters to them saying we consider it out of compliance if certain things happen at 103, and what that does is trigger more investigation, trigger some things. So they were, our interpretation has been that they were not out of compliance, and as you can see, what has happened since that 2015 timeframe, it has gone down into the 60s and 70s. This well is monitored once a month, so we have a lot of data, and I split samples with them usually at least once a year. So that's the interpretation we voiced, and we wanted to voice it to a larger number of stakeholders because of the questions we've been given.
And it's, go ahead.
I can't even read the numbers on the y-axis. So what's the values of the parts per billion? What's that lowest value on that scale?
This is 50. So 50, 60, 70, 80. That's 85 is the red line, and then 90.
Yeah, so most of them are tenfold higher than 7.2.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, we're in confidential
Yeah,
negotiations,
and
changing it to 7.2.
Yeah, and one clear point, while the CJ says, that the level is 85, you have to exceed it. That's mimic of all of our criteria. If the criteria is 100 and you get 100, you're actually within criteria. If you were at 100.1, you would be over criteria. That's not something specific to the CJ, that's just specific in the regs in general. So then the next topic that we wanted to come across was the contingency planning. I know that Scio Township and Ann Arbor Township have discussions on alternate water supply contingency plans. The trigger numbers within the revised CJ is currently being negotiated, so I can't talk too much about that. There has been a discussion also with respect to contingency planning on the method 522 analysis for drinking water wells. EPA's recommendation or approved method is method 522 for finished drinking water. So that would be water that's coming directly out of a tap, so to speak. The CJ currently requires them to use a method that's a little bit modified, or is modified from method 522, specific to groundwater monitoring wells and to some of the drinking water wells that they have to do as part of the drinking water well. On top of that, our drinking water lab in Lansing also does not provide method 522, so they use a slightly different method. But all in all, what we want to get out of this right this second would be that the currently approved, both in the CJ and what the state lab uses, provides a level of detection of 1 ppb, which is significantly less than the 85 ppb. As such, we're getting the clarity necessary, we believe, to verify that conditions that are required to be reviewed in the CJ are being reviewed appropriately. And as such, we have not made any move to method 522 at this time. I'm trying to see if there was anything more. Did you want to add to that discussion a little bit more? Or?
We're still in conversation with, we're typically for drinking water at residential drinking water. So 522 is a method that is intended for water supplies. So it's not necessarily intended. So that's something. It's a facility that provides water to over 100 properties. So it's not typically designed for individual residential properties. That said, it is used often by EPA at residential properties where water's being consumed. So we've talked to DEQ about that, and we're going to continue to talk to them about that. We also recognize that
the consent judgment dictates the methods of analysis for that they're employed in the monitoring and the kind of regulation of this site at this point in time.
What does that go down to, 0.3?
Which one?
5.2?
I think, yeah, it goes down to
0.3 part per billion.
Yeah.
No, it's 0.7.
0.7, sorry, but it goes below 1. Below 1 part per billion.
Currently, we go to 1. This new method goes to 0.7.
What method did Gelman use recently for their peripheral sampling?
They use the method that is spelled out in the CJ, method 1624, EPA method 1624, and B. And so that is what they have been using in compliance with what is current in the current CJ.
With a low flow sampling method.
I don't think we need to get into too much of the details there. Basically, the consent judgment dictates the methods that are being used. EPA is in conversation with DEQ about 532. And yeah, 532 is a method that EPA typically uses at residential properties.
Next.
All right. Next, I'm going to kind of tie these two together, which is this delineation of contamination and due care. So, you know, Gelman has voluntarily conducted additional soils and groundwater sampling on adjacent to their site. The DEQ is expecting a report summarizing that investigation once Gelman has compiled it and evaluated the site investigation information. We haven't gotten that yet. I do believe that currently, as the negotiations are going on, the focus of Gelman's work has been on negotiating the CJ and complying with the current CJ requirements, not necessarily completing this report, but that's my own personal take. But as we talk about the site in general, and we start to get into due care, we currently, there's a couple of different owners for what we call the former Gelman property itself, which is the actual operation for Gelman, the source property, as it were. And those owners, were fully aware of the situation and the data results, and they each had their own independent environmental consultants look at the data with respect to their we call them kind of due care obligations, specifically their 7A Part 201 07A, which is due care, which basically tells you what you need to do as a property owner of a contaminated property. There's about 6 different little parts of due care. The biggest one that we would be concerned with is the mitigation of any unacceptable exposures. They have done their work. They have done BEAs based on environmental assessments to protect themselves from liability that required some work to be done. Their consultants were afforded the opportunity to look at the files necessary to complete various phase 1s, phase 2s, and things of that nature that were required for funding, like institutions as part of those deals. We have some regular contact with the current property owners, and we continue to discuss due care, what that means, what it looks like. Due care is not something that you show compliance with and then walk away. It is something that is ongoing. It is always there, regardless of changes in statute or anything. It's still always there, and you have an obligation to meet due care at the current time. So if criteria changes, you as a due care or owner of property need to look at your property with respect to the new criteria. You can't rely on, well, I was good a month ago with the old criteria, therefore I'm fine. You have to continue to look at your property as things evolve. Both of these owners, or the owners, understand that. We've had conversations with them, and they're taking their steps to verify ongoing that they continue to meet their obligations under the law.
Now, this is, I asked Jerry to talk about this, about the due care issue, after having had conversations with many of you in this room via email or over the telephone, where we've talked about this subject. And what I've expressed is that really this is something that falls under a different part of DEQ.
the folks who manage that due care process, and then also having spoken with one of the property owners at the very least, where they express that they've been doing the monitoring, doing the work, and not seeing the risk at the property. This is another issue I don't think we really need to continue to talk about in this venue. I wanted to make sure we talk about it today just to kind of lay that one to rest, having it been already a topic of conversation in this group already.
Moving on, the last really part that we had was this question of ground, or let's just say surface water, rainwater infiltration within the area of the facility. This is something that our geologist engineer Kevin Lund and Evan have been discussing. And I think that, Evan, you had a few things you wanted to weigh in on that? Yes, no? No, okay.
Not at this time.
I didn't know. So, the question has been, developments in the area have been using infiltration as a means to control stormwater. And so, just in a quick nutshell, all the stormwater, if you send it all down the pipe, you end up with, issues downstream of, floods and things like that. So they are doing these developments with the idea that they're going to retain some of the water for a period of time on site and either allow it to evaporate or otherwise slowly discharge it after the peak rain events have gone. One of the things that have been done in this area, which have been done in numerous places, not just in Michigan but throughout the country, is consolidating that rainwater into an area in which you're going to allow it to just infiltrate into the ground. We don't necessarily believe that is a large issue specifically with the property that's in question, but realizing that just saying it doesn't appease everyone. Both Kevin and has been working with various members of local government on how to quantify that, how to look at that better, and how to come back to this group with a more comprehensive, kind of a scientific look at what potential effect would there be if there is any. And we're working hot and heavy on that right now. I don't necessarily have a time frame specific in my mind, but Kevin tends not to do things without a time frame, so I'm sure he's got an internal time frame of when he wants to complete that review. There's been a lot of developments up and down that stretch, and we hope that there will be more, as far as that. So that's an issue that I know it got brought up, and I wanted to put it to bed that we are looking at. It's not just we've made our decision and we're done with that and not to talk about it again.
Yeah, the core issue is there an area where our office should not be requiring infiltration? Is there some criteria around that? And I think that's just to be determined. It's being worked on, trying to correlate data that's already there. And like Michael has said, we've got information that we can use. We just maybe haven't sliced it and diced it that thing.
Thank you. Before we get into our comments by stakeholders, and leave this current segment of our talk today, I want to bring up that there are some ongoing issues and topics that we are still pursuing. One of the questions EPA had was PFAS. Has it been sampled for? What is, is it a contaminant out here that poses a risk? So that's something we don't have an answer to yet. We're still working on. What's the ecological risk posed by the contamination that remains in the soil at the facility or at wetlands outside the facility? That was one of the first topics we heard about from stakeholders, and that's something that we're still holding on to as a topic that needs to be addressed. Jerry or Dan, are there any more topics that you can think of immediately that?
No, and I can give a little bit I don't know if it's necessarily an update on PFAS. Most of this information is being vetted. I'm also the regional lead, site lead, they call it, for PFAS for MPART, which is the organization, or not organization, but a group of members of government, state government that are working on the PFAS issue. We have asked Gelman, and they have completed a review of their records, They do not believe that they ever used PFAS. They say they don't have information, and they are putting it together in a response, a formal response to us about their usage. Additional to that, we have done and continue to do sampling within the surface water all throughout the Huron River watershed, and a lot of that information has been disseminated and will continue to be disseminated. At this point, through the area in which we would have the potential to have surface water venting or groundwater venting to surface water from what I would call the Gelman plume area, we have not seen what I would consider elevated levels of PFAS. There really is no quote-unquote background level of PFAS because PFAS in itself is a man-made, but we're not finding the elevated concentrations that we found, say, in the Wixom area. Some of the areas that we found through the stretch range in the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 range versus the 1500s and the 5000s that were found further upstream in Wixom. But that's all I wanted to say about that specifically, is just if you have any questions otherwise on PFAS, feel free to contact me. I got contact to get answers for pretty much any question you need on PFAS right now.
Kevin, I want to hijack your, I've been getting some text messages. Some of our elected leaders and others who are part of the group have to leave the room. So as you're going around the room, if we can start, we can kind of stay with elected card, M&A, and then get the rest of the crowd, we will be able to capture those.
Yeah.
Bryce, I think there's, Jerry and Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but also VOCs and SVOCs, that's something in terms of the Gelman fingerprint that is that an ongoing?
That's an ongoing.
That's another one that's been brought up to us, that they had, that there was other contaminants that Gelman used, and just to kind of follow those up. Though, as we all understand, 1,4-dioxane was the primary contaminant or primary chemical that was released as a contaminant to the environment. But nevertheless, it's important to also look at those other constituents too.
I think Gelman used non-wettable filters.
We don't know. It's a question you could ask. Did they make non-wettable filters? So I work in a lab, and that's like an attribute of filters that you would look for doing certain filtrations. If they made non-wettable filters, my bet would be that there's PFAS in the process.
Yeah, just
So it's
real quick, because it's a little
kind of a
different.
proxy.
There's the PFAS, and then there's the silicone-based ones too, and that's the difference that and usually the PFAS ones are heated. So if you needed to process a wetting agent that could withstand the heat, you used PFAS. If you weren't so concerned about the heat, you would then use the silicone-based. I don't know how that relates specifically to the question. I'm just adding a little bit more
that
info.
might be a proxy to give you some idea. I don't know what their filters were like.
Any other wrap-ups, Michael, before we go to the agency comments or updates or feedback?
Just I guess another thank you for all of you taking your time today to be here. And we also understand that for everyone who was able to be here, I know there's a lot of other people who wish they could be here, but were not able to pull themselves away. Unfortunately, we're not able to pull themselves away from whatever they were doing today. So we appreciate their interest and their concerns too.
So I guess maybe start over in the corner. I see 3 of the 4 impacted communities kind of clumped up there. Christine, do you want to have any local agency comments or reports?
Just want to thank everybody, including Representative Dingell, out of the room, yes, and Representative Lasinski for appearing here today, and everybody from the agency. We really appreciate having the update. This is only the second one of these quarterly meetings that I've been able to attend. So I really appreciate having the background and just some basic facts as to where we are right now. I think probably every member of the interveners, every representative of the interveners is extremely frustrated by the fact that we can't communicate what's going on. I know that it's certainly very frustrating for the public, it's very frustrating for us, and it's very frustrating for all of you who want to help us. So we are mindful of that. I just wanted to say that to make sure you know that we're doing our best. So that's it. I don't have any specific questions right now.
The only thing I would want to make notice of is we are transferring the point of contact of the
city. Matt Donna to Brian Steglis, who's sitting in the back row. As Matt looks to retire, Brian, who is runs our water utility, is going to be our primary point of contact.
Brian, can you raise your hand? Good to see you again.
Dave heard on the radio last week.
Yeah, again, as Chris very well put it, being an intervener, we can only go so far, ask so many questions. I do have one thing, and that is, given 465 DuPont, I'm assuming that when that was when that came to light, that was probably a township island. Them having had a well, City of Arbor doesn't prevent or doesn't permit wells, I don't believe, on residential property. So at that time, it's probably a township island. There are other township islands in that area, and I'm wondering that if those people have been advised as to what was found on 465 or not, and if not, should they be alerted to have their wells tested? That's all. And I guess, and if they should be alerted, should that be coming from DEQ? Should it be coming from the township? Who, what agency would be responsible for doing that?
It wasn't just an island, that was Scio Township.
I know, yeah.
Yeah, there were no islands
okay.
because the city was at Maple Road.
Well, yeah, granted, but we have a number of township islands.
Still, because they're vacant parcels.
Right, exactly. Well, not all of them are vacant parcels.
They can't have wells in that area. That's
Well, if they're
prohibited.
township islands, they can have wells.
I think the bigger point is like we need
Double check.
Yeah, we
double
need to
check and
There's no
communicate with
existing drinking water
communicate with
wells in
these
those
people.
islands.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
fine.
I got it.
That's
And I'll
fine.
make sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
I don't know, I have an answer to it now, but we will definitely make sure we look into that.
Thank you.
Okay, from Ann Arbor Township, excuse me, we're not one of the interveners, but we were one that petitioned the EPA to allow. I have a few comments. One is that you're certainly correct that with the current interest in PFAS, that it has renewed interest and coupled with the interest and concerns about 1,4-dioxane. Ann Arbor Township continues to be very concerned about the inadequacy of the monitoring network. And frustrated by the negotiating process. Let me just say that perhaps there's a question I can ask about the negotiating process that can give us a little thought without asking a question about any single issue. And that is one of the major concerns we've had, and one of the things that was prominent in the negotiation was moving to the 7.2 standard. In the negotiations, have there been any agreements made? And if there were any agreements made so far, any resolutions agreed to, are these subject to the entire agreement being reached, or agreement being reached on all issues?
Are you asking if like basically they can share any resolved issues if there's
I'm not
complete
even
agreement?
asking them to share. In the process of these negotiations, have you reached any agreement whatsoever that will be binding in this process when you get to the end of your negotiations? Or if you don't agree on everything, is it nothing done, so we've gained nothing in 2 years? That's what I want to know.
Mike, I always err on the side of caution, but I really don't think we can answer that question. I'd like anybody else to pipe in who's involved in the negotiations, but I do not believe we can answer that question.
Speaking as someone who's not,
Does that mean that's still being negotiated?
That's what everyone's agreed to.
If I could interject here a second, just because EP is not a part of the negotiations. I totally, Mike, I understand where you're coming from, and there's been many, many times where I've wanted to say, guys, come on, just tell me what's going on. What is it on this particular on this topic or that topic, and I haven't because EPA very much wants to see these negotiations play out. We completely understand the frustration that people who are not party to it have. But we want to see these negotiations play out as they are.
Well, except what I'm saying is, we don't know what they are.
I understand that.
There are negotiating agreements that have to do with facts and agreements in that resort. There must be some process that's been agreed to in advance of those negotiations. That either you're going to reach interim agreements and report them all out at the end, or no agreement's been reached unless everything is agreed to. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, we just can't answer that question. Somebody else, I would love to weigh in on this, but I would not feel comfortable having any of us answer that question.
Well, I can only weigh in as a citizen, as a member of the public. I think it's important to state that this confidentiality agreement was originated by the parties to the agreement, that it was not a requirement from the judge, that the nature of the agreement effectively shuts out the public as well as the EPA because there is an absence of reporting, there is no timeline, there's no tangible outputs after 1 year. There's nothing to prevent this from being a delay tactic, is our concern as the public.
I
We have no
understand.
assurance otherwise.
Right.
And when we ask for assurance, we're told, oh, there's a confidentiality agreement, we can't talk about it.
Understood.
I understand.
All valid points, absolutely.
I understand exactly what you're saying. I just want to be really clear, though, that when EPA enters into negotiations with a responsible party, one of our sites, those negotiations are also confidential. So that it's not something exclusive to the situation where negotiations between responsible parties and a regulatory agency are confidential. Something we do too.
Let me ask you a question. When you're engaged in confidential negotiations and you do not communicate what's going on, do you ever, over the long course of negotiations, work with the other side or get permission to make an interim report of some kind to the public?
I haven't been in that situation previously, so I could look at I could ask around, but I personally have not had that arise.
What about the DEQ?
I'm sorry, Christine, maybe we could put a pin in that last question, though, and say,
Yeah.
that'd be a great thing to go back and maybe try to answer later. I think answering questions here,
Yeah.
and if we could maybe hold the question piece till
Yeah.
after everybody's had a chance to sort of do their report out, that might help us too. But Mike, it's a very good question.
Yeah.
I think one that deserves to be
One
asked.
other quick comment. Howard, the city of Ann Arbor is going to get a bunch of properties from Ann Arbor Township, including some around the Arboretum over the last year and the next few years, all of which have wells. So it might be an opportunity to be sampling some of those as well, and suggest that to both the DEQ and EPA that there are wells available in areas of concern that will very soon be in the city, who is intervening. And currently, you're in Ann Arbor Township, a concerned area, even though we're not in the
Thank you.
That's all.
I think it's Donna.
Oh, no, I've had plenty of time to comment.
I just want to, as a non-elected official, but having ceded some of my time earlier, I just wanted to say this is not a static process. I think these meetings are really good. EPA is looking to improve all of this process as we move forward. That goes to the quarterly reports, trying to figure out more effective ways of tracking issues, making the answers more accessible. And so not right now, but I would like to hear from people if they have suggestions on how to improve that process. Also, as a question for this process here, in terms of these kinds of in-person meetings, we have not had Gelman at the past few meetings. Something to think about. Would it be valuable to have Gelman at these meetings? Would these be productive meetings with them present?
We've invited them.
We used to do that in 95, 96.
Well,
Before there was a card, before there was a other meetings with this, we had all the stakeholders in one monthly meeting and negotiated a settlement that the township signed. And there was supposed to be 2 other documents signed to make that happen. And the company reneged on it.
Well, I want to look at moving forward. And also, I think that's a question where a lot of people have different opinions, but it's something I just wanted to put on the table. And we can talk about this either after the meeting, or if you want to take the time to think about it and talk to me later, we can think about how it might work, whether it be immediately or something to be working towards in the future.
I have a couple thoughts on the negotiations. What information do the negotiators have in front of them when they're negotiating? Can they not at least release that information? Because my understanding that they don't have all the information that's out there. You don't have all the information. You weren't provided all the information in the administrative record that's out there that you should be considering. So I'm assuming that the negotiators don't have all the information that's out there.
Our file's always open to anyone that wants to review it.
All right, let me test you on
Full
that.
access to the file.
Let me test you on that.
Can we kind of stick with the agency reports again and try to put the Q&A at the end?
Well, I'm chair of CARD, that CARD is an association of all of the agencies that are here. In fact, we meet monthly. What is the highest concentration east of Wagner Road?
But I thought, Roger, we were trying to go to all the elected officials and then run through the agenda, no, Evan?
Well, we were trying to give everyone an opportunity to speak, and some people have had a lot of speaking opportunities, and we will still stick around for Q&A afterwards, Roger.
I feel that you're suppressing.
Well, nobody wants to suppress you, Roger. I guess part of my question, I don't know what's happening in negotiations because I'm not a party to negotiations. But there is Laura is one of the parties, and I'm assuming she's got as much access to, I know you may not trust some of the parties, but we got different stakeholders on different sides of this. Some think it should be Superfund, some are part of the negotiations that are in the courts that nobody can talk to me or you or a lot of people about, but I'm assuming that they've got access to the same information you are, and they're not exactly known for not being very, what's the right word to use, consumer. Everybody cares about this, and so they can't, I've been warned to keep my mouth shut by some of the people in here because I don't have access and not to ask questions, but I do trust some of the people that are at the table. And I think that, and you know who those people are, and we need to make sure they've got access to that as well. But how in the same time do we let people who are living in these communities know what's going on? How are we transparent? How are we making sure that everybody is safe and keep moving this forward? And I'll just go and throw a bomb in this. The fact of the matter is DEQ didn't want this to be, wanted to retain it, but we got a change in leadership. So we'll see what's happening with negotiations and what's going to come with the change in leadership, and we got to all care and listen.
In the meantime, the plumes spread.
I think everybody knows that it's spreading, but I think that there are a lot of people that are really care and are trying to stay very close to you.
I'm trying to get a fact out there to the public right now. There's 8,000 parts per billion that was detected east of Wagner Road, and nobody's talking about it.
I don't know if that's true.
It's true. And it was semi-suppressed for 7 or 8 years by the company. That dioxide's gone somewhere. It may have gone to DuPont Circle. Unfortunately, there was a well there to detect it. Does anybody, Kevin, do you know what I'm talking about? Huh? No. This is a well that we don't have XY data for. It appears on maps, but it's not in the well database.
What year is it, Roger?
1998. GSI 9802 had 8,000 parts per billion, 8,000 parts per billion, and 7,000 parts per billion over a 60-foot span. There was no monitoring well put in. No monitoring well there today. We don't know what's going on now. If, as an engineer, if I found that, I'd say, okay, where's this coming from? I would not only put a monitoring well in at that point, I would go backwards and say, where is it coming from? And then I'd also say, where is it going to? I'd put monitoring wells according to where we think the groundwater flow is. None of that has happened. And this was 1998. We're talking about 20 years ago, folks. Something happened 20 years ago that's still affecting us. That's the level of monitoring that we've been dealing with all these years. I've been working on this for 26 years as a citizen volunteer. I'm still trying to get the level of due diligence necessary to at least define the problem. If you don't define the problem fully, your solutions are hit or miss. And that's what we've been dealing with.
Okay, Roger, let's keep that.
But don't cut me off on that, because this, we have to go forward on this as a unit. No one agency is going to do it. It's not going to be EPA by itself. It's not going to be the DEQ by itself. It's not going to be any one person by itself.
A little bit later. Chuck?
No problem.
Kathy?
Couple comments and then a question. On the PFAS issue, you know, I've participated in your webinars, I've gone to many of the meetings. I want to raise the consideration to the DEQ that there is a reasonable basis for the DEQ to request Gelman to do PFAS testing on site. And this is because of the long manufacturing history there, the use of many chemicals, and Gelman's history of self-reporting is shaky. You're basically relying on Gelman to self-report as to whether or not they've used any of these chemicals. And they haven't been a reliable self-reporter in the past. And I know others in the room could speak to that a little bit, but I'll go on. That's my comment. Here's my question. As I sat here, I reviewed my notes from the earlier sessions that we've had, and really this question is for you, Michael. Early on you said that the EPA would reserve the right to pursue enforcement actions if you thought that would become necessary. And I'm wondering, what would that look like? What would the trigger be to get the DEQ to do more or to pursue enforcement actions or start the process? What are you looking for?
I think what we would have to see is actual exposure to levels of pose or risk, probably far above, seeing 7.2 in someone's drinking water where they're actually drinking it, and there's not the infrastructure in place or not the capacity to be able to provide water to them immediately. So I think it would be an extreme circumstance, what we would call an imminent and substantial endangerment. It's not a qualitative statement, that's an actual specific statement that the EPA makes. So if we had what would be an imminent and substantial endangerment situation, that's where we would potentially look to take some kind of enforcement action to move immediately. Based on what I've seen, we don't have that situation here. I think that based upon the screening levels, Vince, that we're well enough below the screening levels.
And when the level actually goes, the enforcement level goes down to 7.2 during that time frame, might you see it then?
No, I don't believe so. And already, I'm looking at it from the perspective of 7.2. So that rule's already come out, whether it's in the CJ or not. That rule's already come out. So that's how I look at this site.
Kathy, all set?
Yep.
Ellen?
ditto, I think these meetings are very important to get all the perspectives out on the table. So appreciate Congresswoman Dingell and Michael. We are interveners, so not much to say there. We're continuing our work to provide testing, sampling along with the DEQ. Share the concern that we keep moving this forward to get it cleaned up, mitigate the risk.
James.
Before I go forward, I just want to also introduce Nancy Schiffler, our chair, and Rita Mitchell, also a member of the executive committee, and as well as Vince, who sits on our committee as well. But if either of you have questions you want to add, please feel free to chime in. Again, my thanks as well to Congresswoman Dingell and Michael, and to all the parties here that made this meeting happen, and very satisfied with that you continue to do this. I do have some concerns on behalf of the organization I represent, and that is, there's some from Mr. Moran's. I do not like the lack of information that's forthcoming that we discussed. I would further add, go back to your original statement, we have concerns over the dilution and dispersion philosophy of cleanup itself. Leading to that, I guess this is probably covered under the consent judgment. I probably won't get information from it. But with respect to the cleanup itself that's going on right now, and this is to Michael, do you have tools to ask for a greater, the best practices for cleanup, like ultraviolet than what's being used right now? Can you address that over there?
It's not a Superfund site, so I don't have any enforcement authority on the site at this point in time.
Yeah, I guess that's my concern a little bit. I'd like to see best practices in place so that we can talk about final cleanup and take care of the remnants rather than having new issues emerge. I guess that's kind of my lasting comment for today.
Thank you.
Jim Smith.
Go ahead. Chip, you still on?
No.
Anyone else on the phone? So, anyone else on the phone?
Yeah, I'm on the phone.
Yeah, but
I am still in.
No, we just,
Yeah.
any local government official that wants to say something. Chip. No, okay, thanks.
Okay, so I'm at a disadvantage of looking at the back of heads. So, Nancy?
No, James covered it.
Okay. I don't know, Mark, you get the property owner, you want to say anything?
Do you want me to say anything?
No, I'm not the president.
Yes.
You can do whatever you want.
I would be happy to. As a property owner, and having spent a lot of time and effort there doing due diligence and putting together a due care plan, we certainly are in compliance with our due care plan and continue to do sampling. As part of our due care plan, we actually have to inform all of our tenants of the situation. I want you to know that our campus is populated with polymer chemists, biologists, a lot of very smart people. So they certainly understand the risks involved. Our early air sampling was done after the building had been closed for a number of years. So if we were going to find anything, that was probably our best chance to find anything. We had non-detect 414D and only trace amounts of other chemicals, all of which, with one exception, were below residential criteria. So we take this very seriously. We try to be proactive and work both with Danaher and the MDEQ. We're also property owners at the western edge of the plume, so we've been involved in this since the very first day. And want to see a good cleanup done while making sure that the public is educated and given the true level of risk to exposure. So I guess that's my comment. If you have any questions on that,
I'm going to put Jennifer Kahn on the spot. Jennifer, do you want to say something? She's the executive director of CARD. She keeps us in line.
Nothing to add. Okay.
All right. Back to you.
Yeah, I have just a couple of final comments, and then we do want to make some time. I know there are several CARD representatives here, so I'm just following that agenda that got mapped out. So I do agree with Congresswoman Dingell. I mean, this is a really important issue. It's
it's difficult for people to understand, which makes it more emotional. It's not difficult for a lot of people in this room to understand that have been with it for a while, but it's hard to communicate what to worry about, what not. I would be testing radon if I was worried about vapor intrusion in the basement. Many people have, but that is certainly a more prevalent concern out of everything that I've heard and learned about this. And back to the court thing. So the people who have, the agencies that are in court that have joined suit are there for the primary reason of seeking a return back to the 1988 to 2005 consent judgments. That was 17 years of full aquifer restoration. We know that's what people want. Unfortunately, the law got changed in 95, and the consent judgment at some point in 05 changed, but we still had 17 years where the goal was to clean it all up. We'd love to get back there. We know that people would love to get back there. I've never walked out of court thinking, woo, I won. So I think we have to temper what we want with the reality of how the legal system works in the US, and I'm happy to pull together as much information as we can. I'm not involved in the consent judgment, but several of us did go to the Attorney General's office a couple of times, and I know Mike Moran was there for some of those. He's not the only one. I'm trying to think who else. Matt Nod was there. But essentially we said, hey, we also feel like there's some room for stricter interpretation, and we got very strong feedback, and I paraphrase, the Attorney General's office said, if you feel that way, we can't help you until you join the suit. And that's why some of the agencies joined suit. We feel like things should be interpreted differently. Many of those issues have come up today, and I'm hopeful that, we have our day in court and we feel like we moved the ball, down the field, or whatever the sports analogy, or, the whatever inappropriate opera analogy you have for when things are finally wrapped up. But at the end of the day, if there are people who still feel strongly about that and want to join the suit, you can join a lawsuit at any time. That's nothing really preventing people. It's expensive though. So I am not a part of those negotiations. I too am frustrated. I wish I had interim reports, and I thought Mike's question was a great one. And I think I'll just leave it there. I don't know that we're going to ever get everything that we would like out of a court case, but I think the folks who are in there are honestly trying, honestly understand these issues, and I have a hard time believing that the key points that have been brought up today of concerns, I have a hard time believing those are not on the table and are not being pressed hard. I'll leave it at that.
So maybe wrap it up?
Yep. Well, we'd like to give Card a chance after the...
Yeah, absolutely, but I know we both have to...
Yep, some people are going to disperse.
Yep.
I'm going to hold another meeting with Mike in 3 months, and we'll structure the agenda, get your input, and we're all available, and Donna summarized.
And unfortunately, I have to leave also, but, we'll hear from Card, but I think, we wanted those couple key takeaways from the beginning, that we're improving the monitoring network with the goal of getting it to being capable of 7.5 parts per billion, which to me means we will be finding the edges and the directionality, and we're going to be chasing that over time. That we are going to, that right now the surface water levels are at a point that they are non-detect and not a concern in those areas. And that we are still operating under a regulatory framework that requires containment, not cleanup. And if that continues to be a concern for us, that is something, hopefully that, perhaps with some changes where we are in state government and with continued community voice through your representatives, that we will continue to prioritize going forward. But at this point, the active process to set up the structure for how we are moving forward is largely contained within the new consent judgment and the negotiations that are going forward. And that while we can't discuss those openly here, as someone who is outside of that, I hope that those who are on the inside, I know that you are all hearing the continued high level of concern, the continued desire to not want to have to worry about whether or not we turn on our tap and what comes out of it is drinkable, and that we want to protect our community by understanding the science of what is there, what isn't there, not raising fears when it's not appropriate to raise fears, but by being continually vigilant and working towards that goal that our children and grandchildren are not hampered by this. in leading prosperous and successful lives. So with that, I do believe we are all on the same page. I do believe we are all working towards the same goal. And I do believe that with our continued cooperation between the data sources, both past, present, and future, we will get to the point that we need to. And so with that, thank you so much for everyone's
Just
time.
follow up. Remember that we also have the pathway to follow up and make it into a Superfund site. And if we do that, it would give the community a complete restoration of the aquifer to drinking water standards and halt the plume. So, you know, the other point is if Gelman were to become a US EPA Superfund site, all of the defective consent judgment terms and conditions would go away, and they'd be replaced by a federal Superfund circle administrative order. Therefore, there would be no further expenditures of municipal resources to combat Gelman. Instead, you'd have the U.S. Department of Justice and U.S. Regional Counsel there to create an administrative order and force that on Gelman to comply with. And this would be, of course, supported by U.S. EPA staff that is very technically strong and administratively capable. As we discussed back in 2016 with U.S. EPA, on a similar site, if there was an administrative order, the first thing they would do is actively restore the aquifer to a protective drinking water criteria. Second, they would extend the municipal water supply line to any water that could be impacted and drained by a resident. They'd halt the plume expansion and treat the outer margins, and they would require that Gelman pay for residential well sampling and dioxane analysis. They would also offer a community grant for us of up to $50,000 as a first time. So while we're talking about here the consent judgment and the negotiation and the frustration that everyone has over the last couple of years, which has spent, as the city and county know, hundreds of thousands of dollars and oodles of staff time, there's this other pathway that we discussed back in 2016, which is still viable. Which is if everything unfortunately goes as it's going now, not very well, in the consent judgment, the community can come together and say, right, we've got US EPA here, we can still go on the path of making it into a US EPA Superfund site, which will be different than currently you have with DEQ, which is a dilution remedy. This would be a restoration remedy. So I just point
and I'm
that
not
out.
going to disagree with any of those comments that you've made. I think that's why we started down this path. That's how we had Michael join us here in Michigan and bring that. I think from the outset, the criteria to become a Superfund site have been a bit of a challenge to us here, given the facts on the ground that we have a known polluter. It's not an abandoned site, that there is ongoing work. And so I think that's exactly why we are all here together, is so we can do not an either or, but a both and analysis. That as we move forward with the consent judgment negotiations and the court case, that we also have the EPA involved with us at every step of the way, so that when we have those criteria to become a Superfund site, they are known, they are on the ground, and we can proceed with a both and. I don't think you are unaware with some desire to become a Superfund site by some of the parties involved, and that where that becomes the most viable option to ensure our clean drinking water. I don't think that has left the table at this point.
We're very
Because
much
remember,
aware
it is kind of
that
an either or. It is either you have a state consent judgment or you have a Superfund administrative order. So the benefit of having a Superfund administrative order is all the flaws in that consent judgment go away. They're inapplicable. The US EPA is the primary agency, and then you follow all US EPA criteria and relevant state criteria. But the restoration is the important part. With US EPA, their philosophy is you need to restore that aquifer to a drinking water criteria. Whereas with DEQ, if you still follow that state flawed consent judgment, you're in for a dilution remedy, a continued dilution remedy. So there is a big difference in the choices there.
And my understanding is that at our first meeting, it was laid out that at this point we are or are not, or is there a gray area about whether or not we are eligible for Superfund status?
At this point in time, we've gone through the preliminary assessment process, and in our check back with the state has informed us that they would like to retain this as a site under their regulation, or for them to be the regulators. So that's why we're in this OCA process, which is the other cleanup authority. We've referred the site back to the state, and they are managing the site.
But it is possible for this to become a Superfund site still. If we were to get the government's approval, the governor's approval, I understood that that was the last linchpin. So it is possible for this to become a Superfund site. That eligibility hasn't gone away from.
It hasn't gone away. It's still possible to, there's more steps to the process. Yes.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a quick question to Michael and to Dan? Can other municipalities or NGOs sign on to the petition at this time?
Yes, there is a petition that was originated by Scio Township, Arbor Township, and the Sierra Club, and that petition can be signed off or joined by other members of the community, like the city, the county, and anyone else.
I'd like to also add that we do have a responsible party here, and I think that is critical. EPA generally looks at the responsible party to pay for cleanup, and we have Danaher that bought this company. They're a $65 billion company. They make tens of billions of dollars every year. They are potentially able to pay the $50 million over 10 years to completely clean up this site. Is one scenario that I've been told about. I think we have some really troubling issues facing this community. We have Arbor Township, Scio Township on well water, that very onerous for them to be brought into Ann Arbor water system. There's some debate as to whether they have to be part of the city now or not. You're adding so many levels of complexity and trouble every step of the way we go here, and it doesn't need to be that way. We need the municipalities to step up and say they want to be part of the Superfund petition, and I think we should have our groundwater cleaned up. The city and the township should not be held hostage by this company. I don't think the value of this community is at great stake, and we need to get to a cleanup status that could stabilize the property values and stabilize the economy of the region. And I think bending over backward for the company is not what we want our elected officials to be doing.
I'm going to state very clearly, I don't believe there is an elected official at this table who is bending over backwards for Paul Gelman. I live less than 500 yards from the deepest part of this plume and have for 20 years. So I do not believe that that is the position of any elected official at this table. Debbie and I have tried to speak maybe to around the edges. We have an administration that does not support this becoming a Superfund site. There is an election 8 days from now where we all need to make our voices heard. Maybe we needed to be a little bit more direct about that. And while we are negotiating this consent agreement and while we have the administration and that we have, it is literally a both and. That's what Michael sitting here represents. If we have a change in how that looks, it can open up a broader discussion and perhaps that look will change. I do not believe the door has been closed to a Superfund site, nor do I believe we should have stopped negotiating the consent agreement in anticipation of an administration change. But I absolutely do not believe that any locally elected official here, anyone you have sitting here, has spent 1 ounce of their time bending over backwards to please a known polluter.
Yeah, everybody's on the same page here. It's just that we need to do more due diligence. It's clear that the state has not done all they can do over the years to know where this dioxane is, where it's going, and how fast. We need to, even if the state tightens up, we still are under the control of the consent judgment, and that has some serious flaws, as Dan pointed out.
Jack?
I've got a question for Michael. Other than the state's acquiescence to become a Superfund site, are there any other milestone or bullet points that we lack that the application lacks at this point?
I don't believe so. My expertise is not in the front of the, what we would call the front of the pipeline process, which is the site assessment and then listing of the national priorities list. I believe we completed the preliminary assessment, and it would not move forward without a letter from the governor supporting that.
Do you know of any other ones?
No, that's what they said, Jack, is that the preliminary assessment indicated that it could become a Superfund site. We just have to continue the process, and it stopped because the DEQ indicated that the governor would not approve that, and that's one of the last steps. And so we completed the preliminary assessment, the site investigation phase was done, and really we were ready to go forward, except the governor indicated that he would not approve this as a Superfund site. So if that changes, as Don is talking about, or somehow it changes for a different reason, then we would be able to have USEPA go forward. And their process is they would submit it, there would be public comments on making this into a Superfund site through the Federal Register. And after they receive the feedback through the Federal Register and it's deemed yes or no, then they would make that announcement.
Hi, this is Stu Hirsch. I got cut off.
All right. I have a...
Are you still there?
Yeah, we're still here.
We're still there. I have I guess a different piece of information I received when some of us did go meet at the Region 5 office with Joan Tanaka, who, as I understand it, is at the front end of the pipeline. And the Superfund is generally, as I understood it, and I certainly can't, I can speak less to Michael, but what I walked away with Ellen Rabinowitz hearing was, and Matt Nod the same, was there is one little piece that the Superfund is created for orphan sites when someone has walked, more so than occupied sites. Now that said, I think I've seen, cleanups by GM at locations that it's certainly a viable business and this, that, and the other. So I can't speak to all that, but what we were told at the time was if you've got a responsible party, that makes it very difficult to make it a Superfund site. Other than that, I can't. I didn't hear that it was a slam dunk.
I want to interject here just 1 second. I also want to, let one of our folks here ask a question.
Oh yeah.
But just, Michael, can I just answer that? There's two types of sites, Evans. There's the orphan sites where the actual Superfund money goes to, but CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act, goes after potentially responsible parties who are viable. And so you have an enforcement side, which I worked on when I was with the federal government in Region 5, and then you have the side that spends the Superfund money. And as we've talked about now, Danaher has billions and billions of dollars, and they're a very viable, potentially responsible party. So CERCLA law would apply to them, just like General Motors or other corporations that are responsible for Superfund sites.
So Dan's right there. We Superfund does work on sites where we have responsible parties who are implementing the cleanup. But I just want to, Dan said a lot about what a Superfund site would look like. By my silence on that, that's all. It's very speculative at this point in time. It's not a Superfund site, so I wouldn't want my silence to say one way or the other what it would look like if it were to ever be a Superfund site. But I also want to take the opportunity, Dan, 1 second. I do want to take the opportunity to kind of pull back to the big pictures. Right now, we're not seeing people who are exposed to levels that pose a risk. We are going to make sure that we're looking at this plume to see what is on the way and see where this stuff is going and trying to better track where the contamination may or may not be spreading.
The things that I ticked off, Michael, were from the meeting that I was referring to when we met with Joan Tanaka, which predated your being involved in the project, and she ticked off those things that I just ticked off in our conversation.
I understand. I just wanted to say that. Sir, you have a question?
I just had a quick question. Tucson dealt with their dioxane problem. Is that applicable here?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Tucson, Arizona dealt with their dioxane problem. Is that applicable here?
I don't know. I'd have to find out more information about what they did.
It's out of curiosity question because, I'm on the fence of whether I want this to be a Superfund site or not a Superfund site. Here we're mitigating or containing. Dan's talked about restoration. how many sites has the EPA restored back to, or completely restored the aquifer and the Superfund? Are we going down a direction that's going to get us to a better place, or should it be essentially the same place that we're going to?
I don't know if I can answer that question just because you're talking about, a whole lot of sites that have groundwater contamination, and the approach can be different at all these different groundwater sites depending upon.
In general, have we had success in completely restoring an aquifer, or was it changing grade?
I think it's probably fair to say at some sites we have had success restoring aquifers, some sites we have not. It all depends on the exact circumstances of each site.
It's a long process, as you know, Mike.
We're fortunate with dioxane that if you fully mineralize it, you get carbon dioxide and water, which is fine to put out back into the environment. If you don't treat it all the way, then you get other intermediate byproducts, some of which have been monitored for from time to time, others not. It's not like PFAS, where you can't completely break down PFAS. You try to filter it out, then you got to throw away the filter someplace. And then this could recontaminate something else.
I'm not sure how long we have the room. The good news is probably two of the main people in deciding that question are in here, so I think we've started into Q&A. If there's other questions that...
Well, I'd just like to say one more thing about the EPA's involvement. It's really been beneficial that the EPA's been involved as much as it has this last year or so.
Thank you.
Because the way you pulled together the administrative record, there were some things in there that were not in the repositories that are available to the public. And I gleaned out of that some information that led me to other information that really should be part of the repository, really should be part of your administrative record. And that continues on. Like this 8,000 parts per million, I hadn't noticed that when it first came out. And then again, it was kind of hidden, wasn't put in the well log for that, wasn't annotated with the sampling. And I suspect there are other wells like that, where sampling was done during the boring, but never made public. And that's information we should have, because even if they didn't put a ongoing monitoring well, we at least know at some point in time there was this amount of dioxane at these levels. And the other thing I've found out is that there are some narrow channels of dioxane. And Larry Linke actually did a presentation on this back in 2002 when Tusk was involved, showing that this doesn't spread like syrup spread on a table. It's more like spaghetti oozing out. So you can have very narrow concentrations of high concentrations of dioxane going meandering through the aquifers. And we happen to be lucky to find a few of those, like this 8,000 parts per billion. But then nothing was done about it to find out where it was coming from or where it's going to. Some of it could still be there. That's what we have to, that's the next step we have to take, is do more due diligence when we find these neural pathways, to tackle it right then and to pump more from where the high concentrations are, which is not happening, hasn't been happening for years. So that's what my 2 cents worth.
Any other comments or questions from people who kind of came to sort of get summed up? Yeah.
Quick question. Back to Jack Knowles, he had asked you about any other, reasons for this becoming a Superfund site. And if we continue to say that right now, since it's underground and people aren't exposed to it, that it's not a risk right now to people, that they're not ingesting it. That you're saying that has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on the exposure risk, has no bearing whatsoever on whether it becomes a Superfund site?
No, what I'm saying is that, right now, we don't have people who are exposed to levels of blizzard risk. Vince had asked earlier, or Rita, one of the two had asked, if there was something that would make it, where EP would immediately step in. So as I was talking to Dad, I was saying, well, if there was some kind of,
exposure that was not going to, that at really high levels, that was not otherwise going to be immediately addressed, you might see EPA then step in that capacity. But as far as our process for listing a site, the next step after a preliminary assessment is for the state to then have a letter come from the governor saying that, indicating that they would like it to move forward as a Superfund site.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Can I just add 2 cents to that?
Sure.
This is Stu Hertz from the US EPA. Most members of the public would like EPA to be front and center on every site. We, like states, have limited resources. And we talk with the states to try and divvy up the resources to best protect the public. In this case, we've become involved because of concerns that were raised about an imminent threat, and we've evaluated that issue. And we remain involved at this point. But I want to make clear that we're not perfect. The state's not perfect. We try our best to get the information together to make an informed decision. And I think we're feeling confident that the state is moving in that same direction. That was my 2 cents worth.
Thank you. Thanks, Stu.
Just in terms of a follow-up to your comment, I would say though, I guess as Representative Sierra, we are glad that the EPA is involved in this matter and they're continuing to working with the state to come up with a viable solution to this matter. It's better to have you within than without at this point.
Thank you.
Is it the state's desire to have this, like the EPA, as a Superfund, to completely clean this up to the point of, where it is completely out of the aquifer again and we're clear of it? Or is it strictly the CJ? It's probably, I think I know your answer. It's going to be, that it's going to be the CJ, that, we're going to comply, that it's going to be contained and it's going to be so many parts per billion.
Are you asking if the state prefers it to stay managed by the CJ, or?
I think that's the problem that you have here. That's sort of the rub or the conflict that there is. People here from Sierra or from CARD that they would like this aquifer completely cleaned up again, and the citizens completely cleaned up, and that our aquifer is back to pure form that it was prior to this. Whereas with the CJ, it's never going to get to that point.
Well, state law, Part 201 in itself doesn't require aquifer restoration. So state law in itself doesn't require it. The CJ is just really reflective at this point of what 201 says. So I don't express a personal opinion, I just express what the statute says.
Exactly, that's what I meant.
Yeah, the problem is the state law changed, during the course of this, and staff, at the DEQ, I gather, I wasn't there at the time.
Neither was I.
You're doing what the law says, and that's kind of what we hear. And again, the locals have joined because we'd like to do more than what the law says, I guess.
So the federal law would state clean up.
We have to do more than the law says, because this is a very long term. None of this is going to get cleaned up in any of our lifetimes.
And Roger, nothing's going to be done more than the law. I mean, come on, that's not realistic.
No, that's not quite true.
Is it so that the EPA cleanup criteria is more onerous than the states and it would restore the aquifer if we found that the EPA was in charge of this site and could move forward on it?
It can be. Circles, requires that. So do you want to say? I mean, it's speculative, and it's by site by site, but.
The site is unique. We have not done an independent investigation of the site, so we can't really say.
Can I follow up the question that I'm hearing from a lot of people? And so it's been really enlightening for me to sit in with CARD for these last handful of years, and the amount of data that we have on this site is pretty incredible to me. And I'm sharing it with everybody I can. I'm actually running for city council, so I'm knocking doors, and people want to know about it. It's in the news. And I think one of my concerns is that the CARB doesn't have the municipal support that it might need to aggregate this data properly, to make it available to the public, to the EPA and the MDEQ in a more efficacious manner. And so I wonder if there's any support from the municipalities around here to support CARB a little bit more, to make sure that we can do all that we're doing to help you do your job.
That's a good opportunity to actually, for me to say something that, DEQ on its website shares the data as it comes in. They disseminate it also via a listserv where they notify people that here's and share the data that way. So I think DEQ does a really good job of getting the information out there as soon as it becomes available.
We've seen places where it doesn't mesh up. I think that's what Roger was trying to express earlier.
We've already lost data in 30 years.
Yeah. I mean, the side issue of joining the lawsuit is just there was no anticipation of the local agencies of the amount of staff time that was going to be necessary just to answer questions. The idea was the consent judgment said it was supposed to be restored by 2005, and we're many years past that. So there's always a mechanism to provide more municipal support, but when you look at a municipal budget, you have to decide, are we going to do less of something else, or are we going to ask people for more money to do? This is one of many things that people come and say, I wish the government would invest a little more in this important issue. And there are many issues like this one that are important that I wish we could invest more in. We've got what we've got, and Ellen's department is probably a couple of full-time employees per year is ad infinitum, and there's no separate source except for general fund revenue, and that is really a big issue for us locally that causes us to go to court. We're not even supposed to be spending that money when they're in court and consent judgments, but another reason we're in court is we're spending money that we shouldn't have to. The law doesn't say that the municipalities are supposed to be picking up the tab for providing resident support, but we don't want to just say go call somebody else either.
Yeah, well, I believe me, I'm all behind polluter pay. So,
Mitch,
I'd like to make a quick comment in response to this excellent question here about restoring the aquifer to pre-release conditions, and it's such a critical issue that we all face in this room and in terms of risk communication, because one reason I talk to people about Gelman being an excellent case study in the evolution of Michigan's environmental law over the past 50 years is when the state took Gelman to court and we got a legally sanctioned aquifer restoration remedy in 1992, it required Gelman to restore the aquifer using a 3 parts per billion cleanup criteria. And then, as we all know, the law changed in 95, risk level changed, it went up to 85. Fast forward to 2010, and the toxicology information on dioxin changed, such that now we have a 7.2 number. But even if we were to go the most protective risk range that EPA can use under the National Contingency Plan, we'd end up somewhere between 0.7 or 0.35 parts per billion, which is still 700 to 350 parts per trillion. So my point is, I don't think we're ever, even if EPA, and this is a big speculation, I don't know whether it's going to happen or not, but even if EPA were to step in, somehow cause the state consent judgment to be nullified, such that Superfund remedy could happen, and go to the most conservative or protective remedy of 350 or 35 parts per trillion, as long as we've got the analytical ability to detect it at that level, there's still going to be detectable concentrations left in the environment for decades, if not centuries. And I'm not proud of that. I'm not advocating that.
Stu, hold on. Stu, please let Mitch finish talking.
Yeah. And I'm not advocating for it. I just think it's important that we all, since we know we're going to be dealing with this for a long time, We need to define our terms, and if we're talking about aquifer restoration, still acknowledge to ourselves and to others that there's still likely going to be detectable concentrations left behind for a long time to come.
Yeah, but the objective, Mitch, is to take it to drinking water criteria, as you know. That's the objective, so that you can drink the water, but it's at a drinking water criteria value. That's the objective, not to non-detect, but to a drinking water criteria. And it is easily, if you will, accomplished. It's done all the time. It does take 30. It does take 30.
I don't know about easily.
It does take 30 or 40 years, but in our racket, that's what it takes to get these things done. I mean, all of us here have been talking about this for 2 years, all right, in court or in Superfund. So, you know, these things take a long period of time, but it is a practical solution that's been done every day, groundwater restoration.
And to another point, as far as what, I can't remember who stated it, but you know, for me, being a landowner and on a well, potentially having to possibly be put onto the Ann Arbor water system and then, you know, engulfed by Ann Arbor, the city of Ann Arbor, it's an economic, you know, change that would also happen to me that I don't necessarily want to be part of. I want to stay part of Scio Township and part of, you know, that government. I don't really want to be under the jurisdiction of Ann Arbor. So that's a, you know, a concern.
Yeah, the longer it takes to get the EPA involved and do a proper, at least start a proper cleanup, the more cost and risk is going to be transferred to the public.
Risk continues to go up for me every year. That I'm going to be swallowed up to the from an economic standpoint.
But transferring, minimizing the cost and risk to the public has not been everybody's goal.
This is Stu Hirsch. I just want to make sure that people understand the timelines, because you keep talking about having EPA get involved, and it's not like it's just a magic wand and all of a sudden you've selected a remedy and implemented it. This is a site that would have to be put on the NPL, which often takes 1 to 2 years or longer. In some cases, it's been 5 years or longer. And then, once that's done, the process would be one in which we would enter into a consent agreement with the party to conduct a remedial investigation and feasibility study. Those often take at least 3 years and sometimes a lot longer to complete. After which we then spend time proposing and selecting a remedy, including public notice and comment. Then we enter into negotiations again with the party to achieve an agreement that would design and implement a remedy. We're talking not just a year or 2 years, we're talking many years. And the state is already ahead of the curve with its investigations and its agreements. And that's one of the considerations that we have here.
Thank you.
But don't you save a little time because we have done some of that?
You know, guys, I think I'd like to kind of wrap up this part of the discussion because it's highly speculative at this point in time. I think what we've touched on is that, you know, there's certain mechanisms that would occur were it to ever go that route. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah, so to that end, are there particular issues for anyone that haven't been registered? So somebody who hasn't had an opportunity to chat with us. I think some of these questions we're getting to Michael's right. Those are probably better one-on-one, but it's been my experience over the last 2 years that when comments or directions or thoughts are made of what the EPA can do and what the DEQ can do, there's 27 different versions of what's heard. So I recommend you do that more on a one-on-one. So it's not my intent to kick you out. I told you can stay as long as you want. I'm just wondering if we shouldn't end the meeting and spend the next time just talking one-on-one with people at the table or something else.
Yeah.
Any thoughts? Anybody else? Anybody disagree with anything?
Before anyone, I was going to say, before anyone vacates, I do want to kind of have my ask of all of you that if there are things that you can think of that might improve our interactive process moving forward that you bring those to me. That's something where, you know, EPA and DEQ together are very much looking to improve the process and not, you know, leave this as a static thing that we have.
Roger, did you want to go back to the well that you were talking about that I don't think we got an answer?
I'll cover that at the next card meeting. Has anybody here not been to a card meeting? You should come. Because we go over a lot of the details at card meetings, and that's one particular detail that's popped up in the last week or two. The other thing is, when you contact Michael, I would appreciate if you CC'd card. And there's a place to do that on the website, or it will be. It's cardwc@gmail.com. Because we want to keep the community, there's discussions that are going on. We'd like CARD to be the focal point of all those discussions. We try to aggregate all of the information that's going on. There's a lot of information from different units of government that we've drawn on in the past, and we'd like that to become more of a regular basis. There's levels of information that come from the city, the county, the townships, and there's some information, of course, that comes through the DEQ from the company, but we also have information from the university. The university, it turns out, has done its own testing on the Third Sister Lake and the Saginaw Forest. Was not included in any of the DEQ databases, and there's a lot of dioxane still floating around there without any remediation. So these kind of things, to get a handle on it, we have to be a village. We have to all work together. And CARD is the mechanism that we've set up to do that, and formalized and going into the future. So, and I'm not going to be around forever, but we have to be thinking about what entity can take this for many decades or centuries. What is there? You know, is it the DEQ? Is it the EPA? Is it some local entity that's super CARD to kind of keep that going as, you know, as other entities come and go? The dioxine's going to be there. The dioxine's going to do what dioxine does. We have to adjust accordingly. Is what we have to do. We have to pay attention.
Thank you, Roger. I'd like to wrap things up. I don't want to get into the back and forth. I do feel the need to say, though, that Roger, I appreciate your interest in having CARD in the loop on these things, but communication with the EPA, if you so choose it to be a private communication, that is well within
that's fine.
Your rights. And also, at this point in time, too, EPA is not using CARD as a clearinghouse of information. We appreciate their involvement in the stakeholder process, absolutely, and that the CARD is doing a fantastic job of bringing a lot of concerns to us and articulating them and providing, the background information behind those concerns. But the intent here is to have as much direct communication with all stakeholders through this process, with no one acting as a filter or a go-between between EPA and the stakeholders. And to that, I thank all of you for coming here today and for your continued involvement. And please pass along any thanks to any of your friends or associates who have not been able to make it today, who are also very much involved in this process. Thank you.
I'm going to stick around for a few minutes if anybody has any specific questions.
Other pieces.
What?
Okay. I feel like we should do it. Selfie. I love it. She'll be very pissed off if she's not in Arbor.